Hey everybody. So this is completely outside my comfort zone. I'm not a fan of doing this. This is my second attempt at doing this. The last video I just did was 20 minutes long. I'd certainly like to try to shorten the story as much as I can, but it's a long one. There's a lot to tell. A lot happened over the course of a month. I'm going to be as brief as I feel like I can be while trying to convey the entire story. I'm sorry that it's a little lengthy, and I may try to do a more condensed version later, but this is the story I've been asked to tell, and I'm going to just tell it to you as best I can. The story actually starts in early March when we began to prepare at the hospital for this virus that was wreaking havoc across the world. We knew it'd end up here eventually, so the first 2 weeks in March were spent. I spent 50 to 60 hours a week prepping, trying to help our hospital system get ready for the arrival of patients. The first week in March, around March 6th, Jessica and I began to talk about my isolation from the rest of the family. I felt like I needed to isolate myself, and we began to talk about how we would do that and what we'd go about with that, with the full basement or what have you. On March 16th, I came home and told Jessica I was moving out of the bedroom. I moved into the guest bedroom. Riley made a sign for my door that said, danger, coronavirus present. Didn't know how true that was going to be. On March 17th, I went to a meeting with one of my colleagues at the hospital. There were 4 of us in the room, and one of the people began to cough. We joked everybody had corona already, but he's like, no, it's just allergies, there's no problems here. And then he texted me that night to say he had a fever. I asked him to go get tested, and he did. And those results didn't return until March 26th. On March 17th, I was exposed. On March 18th, I moved fully into the basement and isolated myself from my family. I saw my family at a distance, but I didn't touch them, I didn't hug them, didn't eat dinner with them, didn't do anything else. I talked to them on the phone or try to text or Skype, but no physical contact at all. On March 26th, my colleague called me to tell me he tested positive for COVID. He had symptoms about 4 days, began to feel better, and but had to continue to be isolated from everybody else. On March 27th was a Friday. I usually get off about 2 o'clock. I was still at the hospital at 5 trying to help prep, and I began to feel flushed. I knew I had a fever. I don't get fevers often, but I knew I had one. I came home and actually I stopped at my office first to grab my thermometer, checked my temperature was 100.4. I grabbed the pulse oximeter out of my desk and the temperature, and I brought it home, and the thermometer, and I brought it home. I called Jessica and told her I had a headache, in which she sent me some Tylenol down. I didn't tell her I had a fever at all that day. I didn't tell her I had a fever until the next day. That morning I told her that I had a fever and I was afraid I had COVID-19. I was tested on the 28th, and I remained in the basement, remained isolated. My symptoms weren't typical. They were more nasal congestion and stomach upset to start with. I really didn't cough. I was incredibly short of breath. I had significant muscle pain and myalgias. I've seen multiple people say that this is just another flu. I've had the flu. The myalgias are much worse than that. The fever is unrelenting. I took acetaminophen around the clock. I took 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day, 4 times a day, 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day with 500 milligrams split up in between. The fever would not stop. I had a constant fever of 102 and 103 and muscle aches for 4 or 5 days. But I measured my O2 sat. I continued to be okay there. It continued to stay up until the evening of April 1st. On April 1st, I began to check, and my O2 sat was about 93%. My pulse was about 115. I called one of my friends who owned a respiratory company. He brought me a bottle of oxygen, a canister. He dropped it off at my door so that I could get it and I could have it in case I needed it in the middle of the night. But as the evening went on, up to about 10 o'clock, I began to get worse and worse. O2 sat's falling down to 91 and 92%. Pulse is going up to 120 and 130. I called Jessica and told her I was on my way to the hospital. I took out my phone and recorded a series of video messages for each of my children in case I didn't come back from the hospital. That's scary when you're 42 years old and you don't know that you're going to live to tell your children the next day bye, or that you love them. So I recorded a series of videos on my phone for all my children, biological and bonus kids, for them to have. And I went to the hospital. I had an elevated white blood cell count. My oxygen was stable on 2 liters of oxygen. I had infiltrated my left lower lobe, and I was admitted to the hospital. The next day, we decided to transfer me to Johnson City Medical Center to the dedicated COVID unit there. They had dedicated a floor where they had dedicated staff that would fill multiple roles to limit the level of exposure. And so I moved there on April the 2nd. I went to the cardiovascular holding area, room 28 and 30. Went in and looked at the signs, and I wouldn't leave that room for another month from the time that happened. I spent the days April 2nd through the 6th on oxygen, trying to distract myself, doing crossword puzzles, trying to read a book, being on the phone, watching things, things are going. Things are going pretty well. April 5th, we actually talked about whether they would be able to let me go home or not, and I began to discuss discharge planning, but that was day 9 of COVID. At that time, we knew that usually around day 10 is when the inflammation and what we call the cytokine storm would start, and I was scared on April 9th, afraid of what would happen on April 10th. I reminded my wife about the messages for the kids on the phone. I began to talk about our life insurance policies, about who had them and who she needed to contact in order to get our life insurance policy. Conversations I never thought I'd have as a 42-year-old with my wife at that point. And the morning of April 6th, I woke up, things were okay, but then my O2 sat began to drop. I began to get more short of breath. My oxygen saturation fell to 93%. We went from 2 to 3 liters. An hour later, we went up to 4 liters. My O2 sat was 92%. We went to 5 liters. It didn't come up any higher than 93%. When I reached 6 liters, we knew, and I knew at that point, that the evidence was suggesting most everybody that reached 6 liters of oxygen was going to be ventilated. So I talked to my doctors, and we decided at that point to go ahead and electively put me on the vent at that point to try to give my body a chance to heal. At that point on April 6th probably was the most peace that I felt. God was with me this entire time. I have no doubt that I'm here only because of God and for His interference and for Him, touching me and healing me. But the peace that He provided me on that day was just unreal. I actually wasn't scared at all. People asked me, was I scared about being on the vent? I wasn't scared on April 6th. They sedated me and placed me on the ventilator, and the next 10 days, of course, are out of my memory banks, as we talk about. I was sedated on propofol. As Shalisa would say, I was enjoying my Michael Jackson sleep. There wasn't a lot of enjoyment to it. There were lots of vivid memories and things. I made a whole nother experience in my head of what happened while I was on the ventilator. Some of those things I've talked about with others, with family, some I never have, and some I probably never will. But I had a complete imagination of the things that happened while I was on the vent. Things began to improve slowly, but then there was some deterioration in some settings. There were a couple of days while I was on the vent where things were guarded, and the doctors nor the family were sure that I was going to make it, to be frank. But again, thanks to God, on April 15th, I was extubated. I was put on CPAP and then BiPAP and began to wean down. I continued to require oxygen for a full 10 days after that, but was able to be stable off the vent. I wasn't alert and oriented. I had 5 to 6 days of what you call ICU delirium from the propofol. It builds up in your body, and it remained present for another 5 or 6 days. Just got to take my phone away. I tried to have conversations with her and with others. They were funny now looking back at it, but she was afraid I was going to purchase a boat or do something else silly, so I didn't really get my phone back until about April 20th. It took 5 days at least for the ICU delirium to begin to clear and for me to begin to kind of come back to my right mind at that point. At that point, I'd been tube fed with a tube down my nose for what amounted to a week at that point. I hadn't had anything to eat for the last probably 10 days. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I wanted something to drink so bad. Thankfully, I was not, they didn't do a tracheostomy. I didn't have a hole put in my throat to do the ventilator through, which they usually do on day 7 of ventilation. But they let me remain on the ventilator for 10 days. But those 10 days had transiently at least damaged my vocal cords, my swallowing ability. I couldn't coordinate swallowing. The speech therapist had a heart of gold, and she worked with me best she could, but I wasn't coordinated enough to swallow. I finally, I wasn't coordinated to swallow, even though I would work at it and work really hard. And I was so frustrated because I couldn't get that together. Fast forward to April 23rd, I had had physical therapy the day before. I'd gotten up and moved around. I think by that point I'd really stressed myself. I'd walked around the room one time on April 22nd, but my leg began to have pain in it. I tried to explain away that it was pain from exercise. I knew it was a blood clot. I had them order an ultrasound. It showed a blood clot. They took me to CT. It showed multiple pulmonary embolisms, or clots thrown off to the lungs from the clot in my leg. On April 23rd, I was put back in ICU status. I was put on a heparin drip to thin my blood. They ran the drip under the door and ran the machine from outside, so then nobody had to come in to be exposed to me as they ran it. And that was probably my lowest point of hospitalization. That was probably when I was most scared. I thought at this point I'd gotten over the disease. I'd stood up for the first time on April 17th, which, by the way, I could only do for about 3 seconds. I was so debilitated at that point. I began to make progress in PT, and I thought I was on my way. And then April 23rd, I was put back in ICU status with blood clots that are dangerous and are deadly in and of themselves. And I was like, what else will happen? I began to have some heart arrhythmias on that day. I began to have bouts of PSVT. I knew that if that continued, they would try to shock my heart back into rhythm, and I was scared to death that they'd put me back to sleep again with propofol, that I'd build up the delirium again, and I'd start all over. I hadn't really seen my family in a month by that point. I missed them so much. I wanted to see them so badly, and I wanted to move to rehab. They continued as the 23rd went on. We began to see some improvement. They tested my heart, and praise God, there was no damage to my heart from the blood clots. They took me off the heparin drip, put me on oral medicines, and I continued my physical therapy, and we began to talk about moving to a rehab hospital. However, I continued to test positive for COVID. I had probably 10 nasal swabs. I had multiple positive tests, one after the other, and then I finally got a negative around April 26th or so. It wouldn't be exactly. They came back to do another one the next day so they could move me to rehab, and it was positive again. We now know that COVID patients can continue to have positive results for up to 60 days after their test. They can continue to have viral particles in their body that are picked up by the PCR testing. It doesn't mean they're infectious, but it does mean that there's particles present, and the rehab hospital wouldn't take me with those particles present. So we began to do more and more swabs, and just hoping that we'd get to a point where I could hopefully be transferred to rehab. We began to have conversations about potentially transferring me home with home health, and if home physical therapy could work with me. One of the things they asked me was how many stairs I had in my house, and I told them I had 13 to get from my basement to the main level of the house. The physical therapist brought in a series of 3 steps that she could put together, and she made me walk up and down the 3 steps until I had 13. Just at a regular pace, not fast. I made it. When I sat down in the chair, my oxygen was 92%, my heart rate was 135. I couldn't catch my breath. It was all I could do, and I said, I don't even know that I can go home. And I really felt like I needed rehabilitation. Again, God provided at that point, and on the evening of April 30th, I got a call that a neighboring rehab hospital in one of the other Tri-Cities was willing to accept me, even with the positive COVID test. And so on May the 1st, I was transferred to Encompass Health in Kingsport. As I left the hospital staff invited my family to be there, and I laid eyes on my wife and my kids for the first time in 6 weeks. It was very emotional, more than I could ever express, but it was so good to see them, but I couldn't touch them. I couldn't love them. I couldn't hug them. They had signs that they sent with me so I could see. Didn't know where they sent me messages on the signs, and I still have the signs in my car. They're going to remain with me forever. But I moved to rehab on May the 1st. That first weekend was pretty funny in rehab because people didn't know how to treat me. I was the first COVID patient they had. They didn't know if I was going to infect them all and kill them all. They didn't know what would happen. Some of them came in what looked like hazmat suits and full pappers. Some came in with a mask on. Most came in with N95s at least. Some didn't want to be in the room at all. It was very clear. Others were more willing to talk with me about it. Some of the nurses didn't believe COVID was real, even when I was there. And I just had to tell them, well, it is in my case, and I've been in the hospital now for a month, and I hope I had some ability to change some conversations. But we began rehab. They began to work with physical therapy. I had to do physical therapy, occupational therapy, 3 hours daily. Began to work towards that. On the Monday, they relaxed the isolation restrictions. They got a plan on how they could keep me safe and keep the staff safe, and we began to see some uniformity in the way I was approached. I began to be able to leave the room sometimes if necessary, although I had to wash my hands before and after, wear a mask, and go by myself. We began to work towards getting me stronger. The original plan was for 2 weeks of therapy is what the insurance approved. I told my case manager I wasn't staying for 2 weeks. I'd give them 10 days, and that would be May the 11th, and I wanted to go home that Monday. And they said we would work towards that and see what we could do. After 4 days of therapy, on Wednesday they came in and said, we had our team meeting and we decided that we actually think you're doing well enough. You can go home this Saturday on May the 9th if you like. And I was like, where do you sign me up? Get the car ready, let's go. I began to count down the days at that point. We continued to work with therapy. I was able to wean off my oxygen entirely. I could walk a mile. I walked a mile around the hospital on the Greeneville with a therapist and began to feel pretty good. And on May the 9th, the day before Mother's Day, my wife came and picked me up and I got to come home. I'd had one negative test at that point. They'd done another test before I left. It didn't return before I left. So I continued to be in isolation here at the house for a couple of days, really not being very close to anybody. My kids are continuing to remain away at grandmother's house. And Jessica and I really kind of spent time apart until Sunday morning when I got a call that my second test was negative. And really this first part of this nightmare was over. I moved into the recovered category at that point. And I'm very blessed to have made the recovery I made to this point. Things aren't perfect. There are still things that happen. I still continue on blood thinners. Will continue on those for at least another 4 or 5 months. I continue to have to take medications to control my blood pressure and my heart rate. I still get tired and fatigued if I work too long. I'm working 28 hours a week now. For those of you that know me know that that's a small number. I used to work many more than that, but I'm not back to full time at work yet. Probably won't be for another 2 or 3 months. I get fatigued easily if I go too far, if I go, and it's a constant battle trying to build up my stamina and trying to determine what goes too far. But I'm blessed. God has given me a lot of heal. God's healed me a lot. He's given me a lot of grace. I have had full testing on my lungs that have showed that my lungs appear to have recovered to normal. I still have to see pulmonology. I've seen them once, and I'll see them once a year, probably for the rest of my life, to continue to monitor. And we don't know what the long-term effects of this may be. There's been discussion about whether I have to see cardiology in the future or what have you. We don't know for sure what may happen there, but at this point, God has been very good to me. There are multiple COVID patients that continue to wear oxygen after they leave the hospital, continue to have issues, and have not done even as well as I have. But you remember, I wasn't in the category that was supposed to be this bad to begin with. I'm a 42-year-old male. I was pretty healthy before I went in the hospital. Had some high blood pressure issues. I was a little overweight. COVID helped with that. I lost 40 pounds during the course of my hospitalization and rehab. And that's a blessing to get off, but it's a heck of a way to lose it. I wasn't the one that you expect to be as ill as you are. Thankfully, 80% of patients are relatively asymptomatic or have mild disease, and I've seen others that have mild disease. The guy that gave it to me was sick for 4 days. I was in the hospital, acute care hospital, for 4 weeks. We don't know why it strikes some people like it does, but I will say this. This virus is not political. This virus doesn't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. It doesn't care if you're Green Party or Libertarian. I understand that we're all tired, and that we're tired of isolation, and we're tired of the quarantine, and we're tired of the government telling us what we can and can't do. But the virus isn't tired. It's still here. It's still infecting. My wife likes to call it a sniper virus because you don't know who it's going to strike and who it's going to strike most severely. I'm not the person that you would have thought it would have stricken as severely as it did, while maybe some others you think it not. We know lung issues can be an issue. We know blood pressure and weight can be an issue. But really, it can be anybody that can be stricken. I was one of the 15% that required hospitalization. I became one of the 5% that required ventilation and a ventilator. Praise God, I'm not one of the 1.5% that's died at this point. And I don't think I'll die from the COVID virus. I think God's left me here to have a purpose and a story. But please, as you go out and go about your daily activities, do all you can to protect yourself from this virus. Do all you can to protect others from this virus. Wear a mask. There's multiple and more evidence every day that shows masks are effective in limiting the spread of the virus. When you wear a cloth mask, it's not meant to protect you, it's meant to protect the others, and the others are to wear a mask to protect you. If we did that all as a group, we could reduce this virus and eliminate it from our daily lives and return back to whatever normal may be. But please, wear a mask, wash your hands, socially distance away from each other, make sacrifices now so we can return back to normal life as we go forward. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it's been helpful. Hit me up with any questions, and again, thanks and love you all.